It's a tremendous honour to be asked to speak in front of such a remarkable and distinguished audience, many of whom are a very great part of my life at one stage or another, and sadly many of whom I haven't seen since today, so it's a doubly brilliant experience. But I can cap a lot of you. I deserve to speak second because I earned this position the hard way. I dug 7 field seasons with Eric. The first one being in 1957. When I left school, I was working as a technical engineer in a research institute near Cambridge that was really wanting to be an archaeologist. And I went and spent a week digging with Eric at Graeme Clark's excavations at Hurst Fen near Mildenhall. And I have a clear memory of Eric. His equipment for lunch was a large bottle of cider, half a loaf of bread and a block of cheese. So not only did he invent site catchment analysis, he also invented the plumber's lunch. So I dug then, and like Geoff, I saw the 1965 film, The Springs of St George, and thought, I know that bloke. So I rang him up. You could do that those days. You could look up the faculty and they got the phone numbers, rang him up. I said, I'm Mr. Hicks. And he said, come round. And so I had my first supervision in that famous Panton Street basement. And he said, come and dig in Greece. Well, in actual fact, I'd been accepted by Churchill College, but expected to give up my work when term started. But I in fact resigned on the spot and went and spent the whole summer working with Eric in Greece. And some years ago at a conference, I met the pollen analyst Kaspari, who said to me, that Eric Hicks had a remarkable drawing. Do you know, when I was there in 1967, there was a young man who'd resigned his job and taken his family up to dig the whole summer with Eric Hicks. I didn't like to tell him, I said, yeah, that was actually me that we were talking about. So I sort of dug with Eric at Archaeological Research Cave, and it was at Archaeological, and that's 1968, that the first sort of tentative moves towards site capture and analysis happened. R.B. Lee had published his work on the Bushmen, Chisholm, his little book, Rural Settlement and Land Use, both of which were very influential at the time. We used to sit around the campfire and talk about these things, and the whole idea was rather formalised at that time. We then went on to Israel in '68, Derek Sturdy and John Harrison and others, and site capture and analysis was rather formalised around the Natufian sites there. In hindsight, I think we were asking the wrong questions and looking at the wrong sites, but it did at least make a formal statement about that process. It hadn't always been popular since. In 1974, Hodder and Orton published a book, Spatial Archaeology, which made scant reference and faint praise to site capture and analysis, and it was then pushed out of the archaeological record. But that book at least make the point, which is one that was wildly obvious to all of us, was it turned archaeology around. It made people look at the middle of the site outside, not on the edge of the site looking in, as was the structure of archaeology before then. So it really had a very profound effect, whether you like it or not. The other extraordinary thing about Eric, I just want to touch on a few things which I think were important in his own formation. He appeared in a remarkable number of books. This is René Dumont's Types of Rural Economy. René Dumont was the inventor of the Green Movement, the inventor of population problems. He was a distinguished French agricultural scientist, came from a farming family, and he studied agricultural economies all over Europe. And one of the ones he studied was Eric Hicks in Clee St Margaret, where Eric had his little sheep farm. He bought the farm in 1939 and ran it right through the war. René Dumont said of Hicks, he could not be a farm tenant, he had to buy his own farm. He was too proud a man ever to submit to a position of social inferiority. He describes Hicks as livestock, 40 acres of land, 40 acres of arable rather, 75 ewes, 85 lambs. He kept his ewes for 4 years. It gives a whole little breakdown. What René Dumont is writing about there is, of course, a slaughter pattern. And when Eric came to Cambridge, and I really want to hear what Ruth has to say about this, which I've corresponded with Jane Eubank, Lady Renfrew, as who contrived the first slaughter pattern. And I think that was it in PPS in '64. Sheep in the Iron Age, a method of study. And that again has revolutionised the way that we look at animal bones. It's a tiny little pattern. Very early in Eric's career, that had an incredibly profound effect. Dumont also talks about farms having a concentric circle organisation with zones of intensity of use decreasing away from the farm, also says how difficult Higgs' farm layout was, in that some of his grazing was 6 miles away and therefore too far for him to visit regularly. So when Eric came to Cambridge, he was I won't say conditioned, pre-experienced with knowing how animals work, knowing how farm works. And he said at the end of his time, he would never do it again for all of Rockefeller's money. He left his commercial job in London at the outbreak of war on 1,000 a year and finished up when he came up to Cambridge on 400 a year. Dumont says that Higgs began to look for a farm overseas where the agricultural advisor doesn't rule. But he couldn't find one. He sold in 1953 and came to Cambridge to do the postgraduate diploma in archaeology, which is the next best thing really to farming abroad. He also had a profound effect, as Geoff has mentioned, on this whole question, who does bones and how. Look back at his early book reviews, his book review of Elizabeth Schmidt's Bone Atlas. He brings out there this whole question of the way bone studies should be oriented, and saying that they should be writing culture history. He wouldn't have used that particular phrase later on, but we know what he meant. Borrowings, he was good at borrowing. Eric was a great guy to have supervisions with. I had a supervision once with him on the nature of evil, the whole hour. I wasn't sure whether he was honing his skills or just got distracted. On another occasion, my reading was Darcy Thompson's On Growth and Form. For part 1, archaeologists said, go and try it, get Darcy Thompson On Growth and Form, and having to discuss that. In fact, we talked about evil, I suspect. On another occasion, I wrote an essay on the Paleolithic sequence of Europe. And what I did, having sort of come from a scientific background and sort of training and graphics and so on, I ordered the cultures here and the radiocarbon dates here and plotted the known radiocarbon dates at that correct interval, which gave you a very good visual picture of the temporal span of the cultural sequence. Eric said, very interesting, so I'll give you that essay back next week, Nick. Yes, he did. Also, look at Coles and Higgs' Archaeology of Early Man. And where will you find that diagram? And you can search in vain for my name. But I didn't mind at all. It was a great honour to have been plagiarised. Now, more recently, I've re-studied the Halfway fauna. It was looked at by Klein and Scott in the 1980s, and I've redone the whole lot. I think it complements Eric's work, for which I have the greatest respect. I think his work was of genius for its time. He goes straight to the point in his interpretations. I mean, the paleontologist Oyer had looked at the Cassara keel bone sequence, and it sort of varies between gazelles and goats and things like that. But he said in the conclusion, this has got nothing to do with climate, because it's quite different from Mount Carmel just up the road. It's a Paleolithic menu, it's hunter's choice. And that's a view that many people still think is perfectly tenable. Personally, I don't. And Eric didn't either. And he says in his work on the How, there appear to be two possible interpretations to account for the fluctuations in the relative proportions of the main food animals in the cave. This is the Halfway tale. Firstly, they're due to environmental changes, or secondly, they're due to changes in hunting fashions. In other words, choice. These people chose to hunt Dharma, those people chose to hunt Gazella. For some reason, the other species are unfashionable. He took the view, much more pragmatic view, that the fauna will be broadly reflected in that which people take within the limitations of their technology. And I think that's still one of the best statements about what we're looking at when we look at the bones from a long cave sequence, or short sequence for that matter. As a sheep farmer, he knew about the way animals work. And I think that was a key thing in his personal development. Just very briefly, as a person, enormously complicated, very secretive in some ways. He loved conspiracy, and if there wasn't a conspiracy, he loved to invent one. He liked intrigue. But although he used his students, and those of us who worked with him in the field, ended up very slender and very fit at the end of the summers. But he was very loyal, I think, to his students, always made sure that something eventually turned up, which I think is why there are so many in the audience today that have gone on from Eric's work. I think he was very loyal, and in many ways a very kind person. People regarded him as being rather brutal in some ways, but I never did. Perhaps I was that bit older than the other students, so I was used to things. But anyway, I would sell my soul to the devil to relive those years. If not sell it, I would enter serious negotiations. That's the best I can say for Eric. I remember him with great affection.